Lena was 10 years old when she first saw a sky that had 2 moons. She stood outside the landing shuttle and looked up for a long time, her small bag hanging from one shoulder and her boots still dusty from the Earth airfield they had left behind 2 weeks ago. The planet Veldara stretched out in front of her, tall trees with silver bark, wide leaves the color of dark green glass, and a warm wind that smelled like rain and something she could not name. It was beautiful. It was also very far from home. Her father, Dr. Alan Price, was already moving fast across the clearing with the rest of the research team, carrying equipment cases and talking in quick, serious voices. Alan was a plant scientist. He had spent 3 years getting permission to study the forest life of Veldara, and now that he was finally here, he had no time to stop and look at the moons. He had work to do. Lena understood that. She always understood that. She followed the team to base camp without being asked. The camp was a group of 6 square shelters set up at the edge of the great forest. There were solar panels on the roofs and a tall signal antenna at the center. The other researchers moved in and out of the shelters, setting up machines and pinning charts to the walls. Nobody told Lena where to go or what to do. They never really did. She found a corner in her father's shelter and sat down with her notebook. She liked to draw things she saw: plants, rocks, cloud shapes, animals. She had filled 4 notebooks already on the journey over. She opened a new one now and started to sketch the shape of the trees outside the window. The afternoon passed slowly. By the time the sun started to drop behind the trees, Lena was restless. Her father was deep in conversation with 2 other scientists over a screen full of numbers. He would not notice if she stepped outside for a little while. She pulled on her jacket, tucked her small field kit into her pocket, a habit her father had taught her: always carry your kit, and slipped out of the shelter. The air outside was cooler now. The 2 moons were already showing faintly in the pale evening sky. Lena walked along the edge of the camp, looking at the plants that grew low near the tree line. Some of them had tiny yellow flowers that closed when she touched them. She crouched down and drew one of them in her notebook. Then she heard something. It was a low sound. Not loud. Not a growl or a roar. It was more like a slow, heavy breath, the kind a person makes when something hurts and they are trying very hard not to show it. It came from just inside the trees. Lena looked back at the camp. The shelters were still lit. She could hear the distant voices of the team. She was not far. Just a few steps into the trees would not matter. She pushed through the low branches carefully and followed the sound. What she found stopped her feet completely. The creature was enormous. It lay on its side between 2 wide tree roots, its body as long as a truck and covered in deep gray scales that caught the last light of the evening. Its legs were thick and ended in wide, curved claws pressed into the earth. Its tail stretched far behind it, still and heavy. Its head was the size of a large table, broad and flat at the top, with a row of short ridges running from its brow down to its long nose. The nose was where the problem was. Lena could see it clearly even from where she stood. Buried deep in the left side of the creature's nostril was a long, dark splinter, iron wood, the kind she had seen broken and sharp all over the forest floor. It had gone in at a bad angle and the flesh around it was red and swollen. Every time the creature breathed, its whole body tightened with the pain of it. The breath came out ragged and wet. Lena had read about Velthrons in the mission files she had found on her father's tablet. She had read every file she could reach during the long journey to Veldara. The files said that Velthrons were apex predators. They said that no researcher had ever approached one in the wild and walked away without incident. They said to keep distance, make no sudden movements, and contact camp immediately if one was sighted. Lena stood very still and looked at the Velthorn. The Velthorn opened one eye and looked back at her. It was a large eye, pale gold with a wide dark center, and it was full of something that Lena recognized without needing a file to explain it. She had seen that look before, on a dog she had found once by the road near her school, lying on its side with a piece of wire caught around its leg. The dog had growled at first. Then it had looked at her with that same look. Tired. Hurting. Not asking for anything. Just hurting. Lena did not run. She lowered herself slowly to one knee, keeping her movements small and calm. She set her notebook on the ground beside her. She kept her eyes soft and her hands open where the creature could see them. She started to talk. She did not say anything important. She talked about the 2 moons and how strange they looked. She talked about the yellow flowers that closed when you touched them. She talked about how long the journey to Veldara had been and how the food on the shuttle had not been very good. She kept her voice low and even, the way she always spoke to animals, the way that her mother had taught her before her mother had gone. The Velthorn watched her. It did not move. Its breath stayed ragged and painful, but it did not pull away. After a little while, Lena reached into her jacket pocket and took out her water flask. She opened it slowly, held it out, and tilted a small stream of water onto the ground near the creature's nose, not touching, just close. Cool water on the hot, swollen skin. The Velthorn blinked. Its breath slowed by just a little. Lena stayed exactly where she was. The forest was quiet around them. Somewhere behind her, far away at base camp, she could still hear the faint sounds of the team. In front of her, the most feared predator on Veldara lay still and watched a 10-year-old girl from Earth pour water gently near its face. Lena looked at the splinter again. It was deep. It would take time. It would need steady hands and patience, and she would have to get very close. She looked at the pale gold eye watching her. She reached into her field kit. The field kit was small, just a flat folding case that fit in a jacket pocket. Lena opened it quietly on the ground in front of her, laying it flat so the Velthorn could see everything inside. She did not want the creature to be surprised by anything she pulled out. She moved each item slowly and set it down one by one. A pair of thin metal tweezers. A small folding knife. A roll of soft cloth. A tube of the basic antiseptic gel her father had packed for her before they left Earth. A tiny torch no bigger than her thumb. The Velthorn watched all of this without moving. Its breathing was still heavy and uneven. Every few seconds its body would tighten as a fresh wave of pain moved through it. The swelling around the splinter had spread further along the side of the nose, and the skin there was pulled tight and dark. Lena could see that the ironwood had not gone in clean. It had broken partway inside, leaving a jagged edge buried deeper than the part she could see from the outside. This was not going to be quick. Lena moved closer. She did it the same way she had moved before, slowly, with small steps, keeping her hands open and her voice going. She was still talking. She talked about her school back home, about a science project she had done on deep-sea fish, about the way snow looked on the roof of their building in winter. The words did not matter. The sound mattered. The steady, calm, unhurried sound of a voice that was not afraid. She stopped when she was close enough to touch the nose. The Velthorn's eye tracked her the whole way. The pale gold iris stayed fixed on her face. The creature had not growled. It had not shifted its weight or pulled back. It had simply watched her come closer, breath by painful breath, as if it had already made a decision about her and was waiting to see if she would prove it right. Lena picked up the small torch and clicked it on. She held the light close to the splinter and looked carefully. The ironwood was dark and very hard, about as wide as her finger and longer than she had first thought. The outer end sat just at the edge of the nostril, rough and splintered. The inner end, the broken piece, was pushed further in at a slight angle. If she pulled the outer piece straight, she would leave the inner piece behind and make it worse. She needed to work from the side. She put down the torch and picked up the tweezers. She held them still for a moment so the Velthorn could see them. The creature's eye moved to the tweezers, then back to Lena's face. Lena leaned in. She placed 2 fingers of her left hand very gently on the side of the nose, just below the swelling, to hold the skin steady. The Velthorn flinched. A low rumble moved through its chest, not loud, but deep enough that Lena felt it in her knees. She froze. She did not pull back. She just stopped and waited, her fingers still resting lightly where they were. The rumble faded. The creature went still again. Lena breathed out and started to work. She eased the tip of the tweezers in at the angle she had chosen, moving by tiny amounts, feeling for the edge of the buried piece. The Velthorn's breathing changed each time she made contact with the splinter. Short, sharp inhales when the pressure shifted. Long-held breaths when she paused. She paused often. Every time the creature tensed she would stop, keep her hands in place, and talk softly until the tension passed. It was slow work. The light was getting dim. Lena clicked the small torch back on and held it between her teeth to free both hands. She could taste the metal of it. She did not stop working. The broken inner piece had wedged itself at a slight turn, which was why pulling straight would not have worked. She needed to guide it back along the same angle it had gone in. She worked the tweezers with tiny careful movements, feeling for the shift that would tell her the piece had come loose from the tissue around it. The Velthorn made a low sound. Lena stopped and looked at the pale gold eye. The eye was still on her. Not wild. Not panicked. Just watching. She took the torch from between her teeth and rested her forehead against the side of the great nose for just a second, a small, quiet thing, the way she used to rest against the side of her dog at home when he was scared. She felt the creature go very still. Then she went back to work. 3 more minutes. Maybe 4. She lost track. There was only the splinter and the tweezers and the small circle of torchlight and the sound of the Velthorn breathing close to her face. Then she felt it, a tiny give, a shift in the resistance, and she knew the inner piece had come free from the tissue. She eased both pieces out together in one long, slow pull. The ironwood came out whole. For 1 second nothing happened. Lena held the splinter in the tweezers and stared at it, dark, jagged, longer than she expected. Then the Velthorn exhaled. Not a short breath. A long, full, deep release of air that had been held tight by pain for what must have been a very long time. The great body shuddered once from nose to tail and then went completely loose and heavy, like something that had finally been allowed to rest. Lena put down the tweezers. She picked up the antiseptic gel and applied a small careful amount around the outside of the nostril, as gently as she could. The Velthorn did not flinch this time. Then the nose moved. Slowly, with great care, the Velthorn turned its enormous head and pressed the tip of its nose into Lena's open palm. Not hard. Softly. The way a large animal will sometimes lean into the hand of the person who has helped it, not because it has been trained to, but because something in it knows. Lena closed her fingers gently around the side of the nose and sat there in the dim forest light, not moving, not speaking. That was how the research team found her. She heard them before she saw them. Fast footsteps, snapping branches, her father's voice calling her name with the particular sharp tone that meant he had been frightened. The torchlight from 4 or 5 handlamps cut through the trees and landed on the clearing. The footsteps stopped. The voices stopped. Lena looked up and saw 5 adults standing at the edge of the trees, completely frozen, their faces pale, their eyes fixed on the enormous Velthorn lying beside the 10-year-old girl. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. One of the researchers had her hand pressed over her mouth. Lena looked back at the Velthorn. Then she looked at her father. He was staring at her as if he did not fully believe what he was seeing. Lena held up the ironwood splinter so he could see it. By the next morning, everyone on Veldara knew. It did not take long. The research camp had a shared signal network that connected all the human stations on the planet, and one of the junior researchers had sent a short message the night before with a single attached image: Lena sitting cross-legged on the forest floor, her small hand resting against the nose of a full-grown Velthorn, the creature's pale gold eye half closed with something that looked very much like calm. The message had 3 words below the image. It said, "This just happened." By sunrise the camp's signal board was full of incoming messages. Other researchers. Station leaders. A planetary safety officer who sent a very long and very serious note about protocol and unauthorized contact with apex predators. Alan read that one twice and then set his coffee down and rubbed his face with both hands. Lena ate her breakfast and looked out the window. Khor was still there. That was what she had started calling it the night before, quietly, just in her own head. Khor. She did not know why that name. It had just arrived when she looked at the creature sitting at the tree line in the early morning light, patient and still, watching the camp with those pale gold eyes. It felt like the right name for something large and quiet and very old. The team had spent most of the night arguing. Dr. Susan Ward, the team's senior biologist, wanted to run scans. She had a list of equipment she needed to bring within 20 meters of Khor, and she kept talking about what a remarkable scientific opportunity this was. Dr. Peter Hale, who studied animal behavior, wanted to observe from a distance and said that any closer contact would contaminate the data. Alan wanted Lena to stay inside, which Lena did not agree with, and which Khor seemed to have an opinion about too. When Alan had tried to guide Lena back to her shelter the previous evening, Khor had risen to its full height without making a single sound, and Alan had decided very quickly that inside was perhaps not necessary after all. Lena had slept near the window. At some point in the night she had woken and looked out and seen Khor lying at the edge of the trees, its great head turned toward the camp. She had pressed her hand flat against the glass for a moment. Then she had gone back to sleep. Now it was mid-morning and a vehicle was coming across the open ground toward the camp. It was not a research vehicle. It was older, built from dark wood and pale metal, and it moved slowly and with a kind of deliberate quiet that made the whole camp stop and look. Alan stepped out of the shelter. Susan and Peter came out behind him. The vehicle stopped. A person climbed down. He was old. Very old, by the look of him. Tall and thin, with deep lines across his face and long white hair tied back with a cord of braided grass. He wore simple clothes, dark and well worn. He carried no equipment, no case, no weapon. He walked toward the camp with slow steady steps and looked at everything around him with calm, careful eyes. He stopped in front of Alan and spoke. His name was Orith. He was an elder of the Veldari people, the native inhabitants of this part of Veldara who had lived alongside the forest and everything in it for longer than any record could measure. He had heard what had happened. He had come to see for himself. Alan shook his hand and invited him inside. Orith did not go inside. He turned instead and looked toward the tree line where Khor sat watching. He stood there for a long moment without speaking. His expression was not surprised. It was something quieter than surprise, something closer to the look a person has when they hear news they had long stopped expecting to hear. Then he looked down. Lena was standing beside her father, her notebook tucked under one arm, watching the old man with steady eyes. Orith looked at her for a long moment. Then, very slowly, he lowered himself to one knee so that his face was level with hers. He asked her what she had done. Lena told him simply. She had heard the creature in pain. She had gone to look. She had seen the splinter. She had taken it out. That was all. Orith listened to every word. When she finished he was quiet for a little while. Then he stood and turned to the gathered researchers and began to speak, and Susan translated in a low voice for those who did not know the Veldari language. He told them that in all the history of his people, across every story ever told and every record ever kept, no living being had ever bonded with a wild Velthorn. They were ancient creatures. Solitary. They moved through the forest alone from birth to death, and they allowed nothing close. They could not be tamed. They could not be trained. They did not attach. Every culture on Veldara understood this as simply as they understood that water was wet and fire was hot. What had happened last night had no name in their language because no word had ever been needed for it. He told them that a Velthorn's bond, once given, was not a temporary thing. It was not an animal behavior that would fade with time or distance or change of circumstance. It was permanent. It was total. And it was, in the understanding of his people, sacred, meaning it could not be undone, could not be transferred, and could not be overridden by any authority, human or otherwise. The planetary safety officer's message suddenly seemed very small. Susan stopped translating for a moment and looked at Alan. Alan looked at Lena. Lena was looking at Orith. The old man looked back at her and said one more thing, quietly, just to her. Susan translated it softly. He said that his people believed a Velthorn chose only what was worthy of being chosen. That the creature did not make mistakes. That whatever quality it had seen in this small human girl was real and would remain real for as long as both of them lived. One of the other researchers cleared his throat and said, carefully, that perhaps they should discuss what this meant in practical terms, for the mission, for safety regulations, for the report they would need to file. Orith looked at the man with polite patience. Then he said that the Velthorn would not be filing a report. Lena pressed her lips together hard. It was very close to a smile. Alan crouched down beside her and asked her quietly how she had not been afraid. He asked her what she had been thinking when she walked towards something that every piece of training and every safety file said to walk away from. Lena thought about it for a moment. Then she shrugged, the way she always did when the answer seemed obvious to her. She said she could not walk away from something that was hurting. Alan looked at his daughter for a long time after that. He did not say anything. There was nothing very useful to say. Outside at the tree line, Khor sat in the morning light, patient and still, and waited. The nights on Veldara were very dark. There were 2 moons, but they did not always rise together, and on the nights when clouds came in low over the forest the darkness was the kind that pressed close and had weight to it. The trees did not move much in that darkness. The forest went quiet in a particular way, not empty, but held, like something large was breathing slowly and everything smaller had decided to be still. Lena had come to like those nights. She would sit at the window of her shelter after her father thought she was asleep and look out at the tree line. She could not see Khor in the dark. But she always knew it was there. There was a feeling that came with Khor's presence, something low and steady, like a sound too deep to hear properly but close enough to feel in your chest. She had stopped being able to explain it and had stopped trying. It had been 11 days since the night in the forest. The camp had settled into a new kind of normal. Susan ran her scans from a respectful distance and filled 3 notebooks with observations. Peter watched from the tree line with a long scope and spoke in hushed excited tones every time Khor did something he had not seen a Velthorn do before, which was often. Alan had stopped asking Lena to stay inside. He had started leaving the window near her sleeping mat slightly open instead, which was his way of accepting something without saying it out loud. Orith had visited twice more. He and Lena would sit outside together in the late afternoon and he would tell her things about the forest in his slow careful way, and she would draw what he described in her notebook. He had given her a small cord of braided grass, the same kind he wore in his hair, and told her it was a Veldari thing. Something you gave to a person you expected to see again. Lena wore it around her wrist. On the 11th night the clouds came in thick. Lena woke up just after midnight and did not know why. The shelter was quiet. She could hear her father's steady breathing from across the room. She lay still for a moment and looked at the ceiling and waited to feel tired again. She did not feel tired. She felt something else. Something that sat wrong, like a sound slightly off key. She turned to the window. The feeling in her chest that she associated with Khor was different tonight. It was still there, but it had changed in a way she could not name, tighter, maybe. More alert. Like the difference between a person sitting at rest and a person sitting very still on purpose. She got up quietly and went to the window. She could see nothing in the dark outside. No movement. No shapes. The camp's perimeter lights threw a low yellow glow over the nearest shelters, but the tree line was pure black. Then she heard something. It was very faint. A soft mechanical sound, a low repeating pulse, almost below hearing, the kind that certain types of tracking equipment made when they were actively scanning. She had heard that sound once before on a nature survey back on Earth. Her father used similar gear sometimes. This was not her father's gear. She was still trying to decide if she had really heard it when the perimeter light nearest the tree line went out. Not flickered. Not dimmed. Just went out, clean and sudden, as if someone had covered it with a hand. Lena stepped back from the window. She did not fully understand what was happening yet. But some part of her understood enough. She moved to her father's side of the shelter and shook his shoulder. Alan came awake fast, the way parents do. She told him quietly what she had heard. What she had seen. He was on his feet and reaching for the camp radio before she finished the second sentence. She heard him press the emergency channel and speak in a low controlled voice, "All camp, perimeter breach, possible intruders, northeast tree line." Then the sound outside changed. It was not subtle this time. It was boots on hard ground, moving fast, and the crack of a branch snapping under weight, and then a voice, low and rough and not trying to be quiet anymore, saying something in a language Lena did not know. Alan pulled her away from the window. And then Khor moved. Lena did not see it happen. She heard it, a single sound from the tree line, not a roar, not a growl, something lower and more deliberate than either of those things, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once and from somewhere very old. It lasted only a second. Then there was a different kind of silence. Alan had his arms around Lena and she could feel that he had gone very still, listening. From outside came the sound of the emergency lights clicking on one by one across the camp perimeter, triggered by the alert signal. In the new light she could see through the window again. She could see Khor. The Velthorn stood between the camp and the tree line, completely still, its body low and wide, scales up along its spine in a way she had never seen before. Each one raised and fanned out like the pages of a book held open, catching the light and throwing it back in flat silver sheets. Its head was down. Its eyes were forward. It was not looking at Lena. It was looking at the dark beyond the perimeter. From that dark came sounds of movement. Fast and irregular, the sounds of people who were no longer trying to be careful, who had stopped thinking about the thing they had come for and started thinking only about the distance between themselves and something they had not expected to find. A voice somewhere in the trees said one word, sharp and high. Then there was only the sound of running, getting smaller and smaller until the forest swallowed it completely. Khor did not move for a long time after that. It stood exactly where it was and watched the dark until the dark was just the dark again, empty and still and nothing more. Then, slowly, the scales along its spine lowered one by one, and its head came up, and it turned and looked back at the camp. At the window. At Lena. She had both hands pressed flat against the glass. Her heart was going fast and she could feel it in her throat. But she was looking at Khor and Khor was looking at her, and the feeling in her chest, that low steady thing, had gone back to what it always was. Calm. Present. Unworried. By the time the other researchers reached the camp and the questions started and Alan began giving his account to the station officer over the radio, the full picture slowly became clear. 4 men. Illegal tracking gear calibrated to a Velthorn's heat signature. Cutting tools. Containment lines. The kind of equipment used by people who hunted things for money and had done it before. They had not expected what they found. The station officer asked Alan what had stopped them. Alan looked at the window where Lena stood watching Khor settle back into its place at the tree line, patient and quiet as always. He said simply that something had been standing guard. The last morning came too quickly. Lena had known it was coming for 2 weeks. She had watched the team pack up equipment case by case, shelter by shelter, and she had helped where she could and stayed quiet where she could not help. She had not talked about leaving. She had not written about it in her notebook. She had simply kept doing the things she always did. Sitting with Khor in the afternoons, walking with Orith along the tree line, drawing the silver-barked trees and the flowers that closed when you touched them, but the morning came anyway. The shuttle was scheduled for mid-morning. The camp was almost completely packed by sunrise. Alan moved through the remaining shelters with a checklist, ticking things off in his careful way, and the other researchers loaded the last cases onto the transport vehicle. Susan paused once and looked toward the tree line and then looked away again quickly, the way people do when something is hard to look at directly. Lena sat outside on the ground with her back against the last remaining shelter wall. Khor was at the tree line. It had been there since before sunrise. It was sitting up, not lying down, and its pale gold eyes were on Lena in the steady unhurried way they always were. Like it had all the time there was and had chosen to spend this particular piece of it looking at her. Lena looked back. She had her notebook open on her knees but she had not drawn anything. The page was blank. She had started to sketch the outline of the trees 3 times and stopped 3 times. She did not know what she wanted to put on the page. She was not sure a page was big enough for it. Alan came and sat beside her after a while, but he did not say it was time yet. He just sat with her the way he had learned to sit with her over these weeks on Veldara. Quietly, without pushing, letting her have the moment she was in. He had learned a lot of things about his daughter on this trip. He thought he probably should have known most of them already and was sorry that it had taken a distant planet and a creature the size of a truck to teach him that. He put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him without a word. After a while she stood up. She closed the notebook and tucked it under her arm. She looked at her father and he nodded once, and she walked across the open ground toward the tree line alone. Khor watched her come. When she reached the edge of the trees she stopped in front of the great creature and stood there for a moment. She looked at the broad flat head, the row of short ridges from brow to nose, the scales that caught the morning light and gave it back in shades of silver and gray. She looked at the pale gold eyes that had watched her from the very first night. Frightened of nothing, missing nothing, always and only present. She reached up and pressed her hand gently against the side of Khor's nose. Khor was still. Lena did not speak. There were no words she could find that were big enough or right enough, and she had learned by now that Khor did not need words anyway. It never had. From the very first night it had understood her in the way that went past language, through the steadiness of her hands and the calm of her voice and the simple fact that she had stayed when she could have run. She kept her hand where it was and closed her eyes for a moment. She felt the low deep feeling in her chest that she had come to know as Khor's presence, steady and warm and vast, like standing near something very old that had decided you were safe. She memorized it. Then she lowered her hand and stepped back. She turned and walked back toward the camp without looking behind her. Not because she did not want to look, but because she knew if she looked she would not be able to keep walking, and the shuttle would not wait, and her father was already watching her from across the clearing with an expression she did not want to make any harder for him. Orith was waiting near the transport vehicle. He had come early that morning without being asked, which was his way. He stood with his hands folded and watched Lena walk back across the open ground, and when she reached him he looked at her face carefully, the way he always did, reading it the way he read the forest. He told her something then. He told her that she should not think of this as an ending. He said that in all the understanding his people had gathered across all their long years on this world, a Velthorn's bond was not a thing that lived in closeness or in sight. It was not dependent on the same sky or the same ground or even the same star. He said his people had a belief, old and unshaken, that what a Velthorn chose it kept, and that the keeping was not a small quiet thing but something active and real and ongoing regardless of any distance between. He said Khor would always know where she was. Lena looked at the old man for a moment. Then she reached out and held his hand briefly, and he covered her hand with his other one and pressed it once, and that was their goodbye. She climbed into the transport vehicle. She did not look back at the tree line. She looked forward at the track ahead, and at her father beside her, and at the notebook in her lap. After a moment she opened it to the blank page from that morning and picked up her pencil. She drew Khor. She drew it from memory, the broad head, the pale gold eye, the raised scales catching light. She drew it sitting at the tree line looking out across open ground. She drew it the way it had looked that very first evening, enormous and in pain and watching a 10-year-old girl with something in its eye that she had recognized because she had seen it before. She drew it the way it had looked on the last morning too. Patient. Still. Present. She was still drawing when the shuttle lifted. The years moved the way years do. Lena finished school and then university and then a second degree in xenobiology, which was the study of life on other worlds. She was good at it in the particular way that people are good at things they were always going to do regardless of what anyone told them. She worked long hours and asked difficult questions and was known among her colleagues for a quality that was hard to name but easy to recognize, a way of approaching unknown creatures with a steadiness that did not look like bravery because it did not seem to cost her anything. She kept the cord of braided grass around her wrist. She thought about Veldara often. She followed the research reports that came out of the planet and read every one carefully. She had gone back twice for short visits and had walked the tree line and felt the low steady feeling in her chest and knew that Khor was somewhere in the forest, present and unchanged. She was sitting at her desk on a Tuesday morning, 15 years after the shuttle had lifted from Veldara, when the message came in. It was from a junior researcher at the current Veldara station. The message was short. It said that a Velthorn had been observed that morning sitting at the edge of the forest clearing near the old campsite, which was unusual because Velthrons rarely came that close to open ground without reason. The researcher had included a photograph. Lena looked at it for a long time. In the photograph, a large Velthorn sat at the tree line in the early morning light, its body still, its head raised. Its pale gold eyes were open and forward. It was not looking at the camp. It was not looking at the forest. It was facing outward, across the open ground and past the clearing and beyond the hills at the edge of the image, in the direction of open sky. The researcher had added one line at the bottom of the message, almost as an afterthought. It said, "We checked the star charts. It is facing the direction of Earth." Lena set the message down on her desk. She put her hand over her wrist, where the braided cord sat against her skin, worn soft with years but still holding. She sat there for a long time and did not say anything at all. She did not need to.